So the paper I'm presenting today is entitled Social Skills or Skills for Life. So the problem that my compilation of research paper addresses is that of inclusion. So throughout history, whether it was because of disability or race or color or any other issues that we face, we have gone through a progression in schools, that of from segregation to mainstreaming to integration to inclusion. So segregation, originally what we had in schools was when, whether it was because of color, because of ability, or other things, we would separate kids altogether. So at one school we'd have this type of person, one school we'd have this type of person. Before we knew better, we would completely segregate people based on their diversities and differences. And then we transitioned into mainstreaming. So when we realized that was wrong, we threw everybody in a pool all together. And basically it was a sink or swim kind of school. So whether not irrelevant of your ability or your color or anything, you're all just thrown into the same school and you either sunk or you swam. And then we transitioned into one of the last two that we kind of go back and forth today. That's integration and inclusion. Integration is kind of a earn your way into the classroom. So basically you're in a separate place, a separate school, a separate classroom until you earn your way into the normal setting that you would be in if it wasn't for your differences. And the final one and the best one is inclusion. And that's just full inclusion, irrelevant, regardless of your differences, your ability. You're able to be in a general education classroom with your same aged peers, but instead of sink or swim like mainstreaming, inclusion allows you to have the aids and services you need to succeed. And so we go back and forth today between integration and inclusion. And I think the problem with this is that in integration, in spirit, you feel a little bit of segregation. Whether that's socially or academically, these kids that are physically separated, either by time or by place, from their same age peers, from their general education classroom, have a feeling of segregation, and there's some negative impacts on that. So that's what my paper dives into. My thesis that goes along with that reads, although self-contained classrooms concentrate resources for students with disabilities, full inclusion provides these students with critical social and academic opportunities not afforded in those self-contained classrooms. Therefore, we should limit the option of self-contained classrooms from our school districts. So self-contained classrooms being a separate place that students, if their ability gets high enough or they learn enough or they become capable enough, can earn their way into full inclusion. So I think we should get away from that self-contained classroom being a form of integration and strive for full inclusion. And I'll get into why we should do that and why some people stand towards self-contained classrooms as we go through it. So we're going to start with the opposing side. So why is self-contained classroom? Why should we have that partial integration? So there are some perks to a self-contained classroom. It wouldn't be around if there wasn't. Some of the perks of a self-contained classroom is concentration. So concentration of resources, of equipment, of funding. You're able to have people with similar disabilities in a room with more than one adult that's equipped, who's certified special education to actually address the needs of those students, as well as equipment. So for example, let's say that there is a stander and the district can only afford one stander. Well, if there's multiple kids that have the same disability that could use that stander, if they're concentrated in one classroom in one place, that resource could go farther. That dollar could be stretched a little bit more. So that's the main perk academically, is that they're able to have that more resources, so academically they can thrive more because they have access to more things. One of the perks socially of a self-contained classroom is they're with their like peers. So they have other people that they realize they're not alone in their differences and their disabilities. They see another kid with, let's say, a cochlear implant or a hearing aid or a wheelchair. They see other kids that are similar to them, and so they don't feel alone in their disability or in their struggle that they are trying to make the most out of. And this is what I think we should be fighting for, is why full inclusion. So opposed to a self-contained classroom, I am all for full inclusion. Academically, full inclusion helps students be pushed a little bit farther. So a lot of times we see someone with disabilities, we see someone with obvious impairments, and we automatically have lower expectations for them. We think they can't achieve as much, or we think they can't learn as much as fast as their same age peers. Well, studies have shown that as students have these as teachers have these lower expectations for the students, they don't achieve as much. So to go along with this, students who have lower expectations achieve less. In 2013, Schiffer did research where she looked at students with higher and lower expectations and looked at how much they achieved. And it was clearly stated that those who had lower expectations, those from their teachers or from their parents expected less of them, they achieved less. And it may not be intentional, you may not be trying to expect less from students with disabilities, but that just kind of happens when they're not with their same age peers, when they're constantly surrounded by people with disabilities who aren't growing as fast. And so to put them in a gen ed classroom is a natural setting for that kid to have higher expectations for himself and from other people. Actually, the lower expectations you have for kids, the less they're going to achieve. Whereas if you believe a kid's going to achieve more, if you push them and believe that they can achieve just as much as anybody else, they actually fulfill prophecy. They actually achieve more than they would have if you didn't have those expectations. And then the other big plus with full inclusion is socially. So when you concentrate people with complex needs in, like, let's say a life skills self-contained classroom, and they're all in one room, you have all these grades, kindergarten through 5th grade, of maybe like 12 to 15 students, some around there, is pretty normal. And the plus of full inclusion is this kid has ample opportunity to be surrounded by his same age peers of people without these disabilities, to learn and grow from and to be friends with. So there's more opportunity to make friends as in a classroom with his neighborhood school peers. Another huge blessing socially, and I think this is kind of icing on the cake, is those without disabilities. So when we seclude or cut off people with disabilities and stick them into a classroom where people without disabilities don't see them as often or see them as separate, they become less comfortable. It becomes socially uncomfortable to approach somebody who's different than you. So when we take people with these complex special needs out of the classroom, we're feeding into that you can't approach them, it's hard to communicate with them, it's hard to become friends with them. Where if we normalize these differences, if we realize this diversity is a very natural human nature thing, whether that be race or color or ability or disability, if we have those kids just fully included in classrooms, it allows those without disabilities to become more comfortable and reach out and become friends and realize how great those people can be and how big of a role they can play in their lives. So going back to this original idea that we keep going back and forth between integration and full inclusion, it comes down to the way that IDEA and least restrictive environment are interpreted. So IDEA is the law that pushed for students, everybody has a right to an education. Everybody has a right to a free, appropriate public education. And LRE, least restrictive environment, is that students have the right to receive that education in their least restrictive environment, which should be assumed to be the general education classroom. It's stated in LRE that students who have disabilities should be educated with students who don't have disabilities, as long as through aids and services that can be achieved satisfactorily. So why couldn't through aids and services that be achieved satisfactorily? And that only comes down to funding and what we have to offer. If we're willing to give more for these kids, we can make more time and more space for full inclusion. So where possible, I believe that we should be striving for full inclusion over this self-contained integration setting, because academically and socially, it'll bless our kids with and without disabilities. So in conclusion, if we want to get away from a spirit of segregation, I think it's going to take full inclusion. Even though self-contained classrooms and integration has its perks, all in all, I think it sends a spirit of segregation throughout the school where kids feel less comfortable and less accepted. Where if we had full inclusion, we would maximize opportunity of success, with most of all making friends. So those people with and without disabilities can have friends, and I think that's most important above anything else we accomplish within schools.